Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to talk to you about governance and whether it matters. And over the last 37 years, which is surprising to me, but that's the length of time I've been in business, I've been asked many, many times whether governance in fact matters. Often the question comes from entrepreneurs who believe that the requirements of having boards and other like structures clip their wing rather than help them to fly. I confess to you, in my early years, more as an advisor than a director, I wasn't sure what the answer was. Indeed, in those early years, I wondered whether, in fact, for some situations, particularly those of the entrepreneur, they should be allowed to just fly, and perhaps in others, where lots of other people's money was involved, there might be a different rule. But as is typical in life, something happened to me in the late 80s. I and a group of others, all of whom were friends and all of whom had the misfortune of coming from the financial markets, got together to set up a fund, a private fund, which these days would have been called a private equity fund. In those days, it was called a Cashbox. We set it up almost like a luncheon group. The only thing was that we put our money where our mouths were. Our meetings took place by mobile phones. And for those of you who are around in the 80s, a mobile phone involved sitting in your motor car, and if you tried to take it with you, the car usually stopped you. We talked, we made some mistakes, we invested. As we grew, we brought in a larger player who was an individual who'd run many, many companies. He required of us proper governance. No longer were meetings in the car or in the lift, but they were round board tables. No longer did we make decisions on the run, but after proper evaluation. It didn't stop us making some mistakes, but I remember feeling the difference. I felt that our thinking was more challenged. I felt that we didn't act on impulse, but more on thought and thorough conclusions. Our mission became clearer, and when we did make mistakes, we could look exactly at why they occurred and how we could improve. From then on, which as I said to you is now almost 30 years ago, I've been a convert to governance. Not only do I see it as necessary when one is dealing with public monies, but I see it as a tool to assist one to make good decisions and as a consequence to successfully act for the betterment of all stakeholders, including oneself. Given that I do believe then that governance matters, you might ask, why don't they pipe in a bit of smoke and you can all leave? He's answered the question. But I want to do something today in support of the fact that I do believe governance matters, and that is to deal with a number of issues within governance, particularly relating to boards and other things related to them. And I freely admit you may not agree with a lot of what I say, but this is my belief. Let me first start with dealing with the role of chairman. In my opinion, this is one of the most misunderstood roles in all of corporate organisation and life. Most people assume that the chairman is the boss of the entity involved. I actually don't think that in a well-governed situation, the chairman is really the boss. Over the years, I've likened the chairman to a conductor of an orchestra. And I love the fact that so many people now use that phrase. I wasn't sure 15 years ago it really was appropriate, but as others have picked it up, I'm happy to follow. The job of him or her as chairman is to make sure that everyone in the orchestra is heard, able to make their contribution, but at the same time ensuring that the orchestra plays in tune and achieves the results for which it is there. This means that a chairman who only listens to himself, and I use the word his there because in my experience that's usually the case that they're male, a chairman who is too strong will also not necessarily produce the correct end result. The chairman's role then is more, as far as I'm concerned, of a coordination and nurturing role, rather than one where he or she should be overbearing or indeed see themselves as the boss. I should add that this is not to say that the chairman should be weak. A chairman does need to conduct the orchestra with a firm hand. All must be heard, but no one must be allowed to dominate. Discussions must take place, but not go round in circles. And finally, and most importantly, resolutions must be made one way or the other. A board that doesn't come to conclusions is, in my view, a board that will ultimately be sidestepped by management. Even though the chairman is not the boss, he or she is a vital part of the governance of any organisation. And indeed, where the board has the right to choose, care must be taken in who one decides should be the chairman. I'm absolutely delighted that the Australian Institute of Superfund Trustees has developed a course on being a chairman, as this is a role that is seldom documented. I should note that the Australian Institute of Company Directors has recently put out a book on the subject, which to my knowledge is one of the first books on that in the world. The relationship between the chairman, his board or her board, and indeed the CEO are vital, and I think require considerable learning. As I say, the vital relationship is often between the chairman and indeed the person who's ultimately involved as the head of management. In my time, I've seen companies almost grind to a halt because the chairman wants to do the chief executive's role, and generally the chief executive wants to do that role as well. In good governance, the roles of these are separate. I would put to you that a good chairman has a schizophrenic relationship with the chief executive. On the one hand, it is vital that the chairman nurture and assist the chief executive in what he or she has to do. It's part of the role of the chairman as a conductor. On the other hand, the relationship is schizophrenic because at the same time, the chairman on behalf of the board has to monitor the operations of the chief executive, and indeed there may come a time when the chairman has to terminate the chief executive if he or she fails in their mission. It follows that a chairman who is too friendly with a chief executive can't discharge the duties required. On the other hand, which I've seen a lot of, a chairman that hates or is envious of the chief executive can't operate either. This relationship is vital. It requires nurturing and a lot of discussion between the chairman and the chief executive. It is also, in my opinion, something that's worthy of constant overview by the board as a whole. Ladies and gentlemen, it's not my role to talk about whether trust deeds or documents that constitute funds should be changed in terms of the composition of the board. However, I do believe that a board has to be seen as a team. Like any team, or you might even call it an orchestra, it is most effective if it is not made up of people who are exactly the same. The best boards I've been on have got true diversity. This means that a board has to have a balance between genders, as Kate mentioned earlier. I note here that I was an early adherent to the diversity in terms of gender, but I did it because I believed it was morally correct, and I also thought it made sense to choose the best from 100% of the population, not 49%. However, over the last few years, I've seen the effect of gender diversity close up at board level. And I now advocate gender diversity because it's good for the team as a whole. I've said previously that I believe it would be bad governance to have a board made up of people exactly the same as me, middle-aged men with financial backgrounds. It would be very comfortable, I've got to tell you, for us, as we probably know each other and probably agree on most things. But it's the comfort that really worries me. A good team, a good board needs to be prodded. Stakeholders can prod, but they prod from outside. Prodding within is the best. And I put to you that diversity of gender promotes different ways of thinking, and it follows from that that decisions are tested, ideas mulled over, and different points of view brought together before a decision is made. Similarly, I believe that boards that are managing larger amounts of money or funds should consider geographic diversity. First, there is geographic diversity within the states of Australia. I'm conscious that many of the boards I sit on draw their members from Sydney and Melbourne. Where the funds are throughout Australia, there's often a need for someone who has experience and contacts outside of those locations, and also where regional matters may occur. The involvement of overseas residents on boards is one that I greatly favour. On a number of boards I sit, we have business people from Southeast Asia. They bring a refreshing and often different outlook to matters for discussion. While I'm on the question of diversity, some of you may be considering the need for experts on boards. Many boards are questioning particularly whether there is a need for an IT expert on the board, particularly having regard to the influence of social media, etc., in our worlds. It is my belief and experience that the concept of diversity is good, but the concept of having subject matter experts is only good where those experts can contribute generally to the board as a whole, and not just in the particular area of expertise. I have sat on boards with people very expert in very small areas. I've seen them depend on me, and I have to tell you with some trepidation, as we've gone through things like accounts and the governance generally. A board does need all talents, but it needs people who will look generally at the whole matter. As a consequence, I believe if you want an expert in a particular area, then first look for that expert and make sure that they have a general capacity to understand business and indeed the fund that you're managing. If you can't find such a person, I would seek to find the expertise the board needs as a consultant and not as a member of the board. Over the last 10 to 15 years, it's become very common for boards to be appraised. I believe in an appraisal system, but not necessarily in the way it presently is advocated. The appraisal system started in order to see if each board member was doing their job. It was designed as a mechanism to test whether there were lazy board members, and I remember what many who came to me to suggest we appraise our boards would say, you can test whether people read their papers, which was extremely interesting. As I mentioned previously, I see a board as a team. I therefore don't believe that appraisal systems that are designed to pit directors against directors is the optimum. I believe appraisals should be to see how the team is working as a whole. This means that one will deal with individual directors to see whether they are of assistance to the team. If they're totally lazy or failing, obviously they won't be of assistance and should be removed. But the appraisal should not move from the idea of a team to that pitting one member against another. Now, you might say this sounds like semantics from an ex-lawyer. I don't think it is, because I think it means that the questions that one asks in the appraisal have to be asked in a particular way. It's not appropriate to dwell just on an individual. It is much better to say, here is the team. Are all the players playing in that direction? Do they provide value round the table? I believe that the idea of appraising a board by external people is also a good one, and would urge you to think about it, say, every 2 years. The choice, however, of who the person is to actually do the appraisal is as important as doing it. It should not just be a box ticker. And I believe absolutely it probably should be somebody way ahead of just a governance expert, which probably rules me out. I have used psychologists to appraise boards in the past, and I have to tell you, it's been a very good experience. I'm a great advocate also of establishing committees of the board to carry out and assist in its operations. As all of you would know, larger funds, etc., are required to have an audit committee and also a remuneration committee. But my belief in the larger funds particularly is you need more to be effective. The advantages of a committee structure are probably known to you already. They include the fact that committees can take ideas offline rather than affecting board meetings and put more and considerable thought into them reporting back to the board. It also has the benefit, the committee structure, of allowing individuals round the board table to hone their chairmanical skills by being made chairs of the committees and being seen to be maybe the future chairs or indeed not as time goes on. This is no doubt why one had audit committees in the first place, the concept that one needed to focus on the accounts. The extension of that more recently is the requirement for the remuneration committee because it was felt that it's a highly complex matter and one that was very visible. My belief is that you should also consider the concept of a risk committee. Now, before you all say to me, but hold on, our audit committee is an audit and risk committee, let me say to you that by its very nature, an audit committee generally looks backwards. I acknowledge that at times it sets up structures and plans for future audits, and indeed for future internal audits. But in general, it's seeking to check that the numbers, results, and the accounts are correct in their presentation and formulation as they represent what has already been done. Risk, by its nature, should be forward-looking, looking out to see if a particular way of doing things, or transactions, or indeed investment outlooks, will operate in the years to come to provide the return that stakeholders require. The mismatch between looking backwards and looking forwards, in my opinion, doesn't sit well with me anyway in one committee. I've become used to risk committees, obviously in financial institutions where I've been involved, and I have always found them to be advantageous. A further committee, which I wonder whether you wouldn't also consider, particularly where you have multiple stakeholders, is a governance committee. Now, before you leap up, that's not a committee that should debate things like does governance matter, or indeed many of the things that I'm talking about here. But there are so many contentious issues that funds of size face. To have a separate committee to consider them in depth, to put views back to the board, I think would be very welcome. To give you an example, there is the example of whether one should invest in cigarette manufacturers. This I met when I was chairman of the Future Fund, and to have a well-chaired, in our case, governance committee was very, very useful, who could look to the experts, who could look at the data, who could help us to come to a decision which was not absolutely easy to do so, but indeed, because of their help, was in fact quite an easy decision in the end. I should add that I'm not advocating that committees should make decisions in lieu of the board. I see the committees as committees of the board, not just reporting to them, but also adding to them as additional capacity. I should add that in my travels, I have never, ever seen board members who don't want to do more. And the committee structure allows them to not only show off to the chairman, but generally that they're involved, that they're contributing, and that indeed they may even have some specialisation within what's being done. I know that the concept of independence in relation to directors is a much discussed issue, and one particularly in this area where you're operating that is under discussion. I don't propose to cover it in its entirety today, but in the quest of determining whether governance matters, I'd like to make the following observations. I am persuaded, after 37 years in business, that independence is often a state of mind. In my time, I've seen many outstanding directors who, on the face of it, have come with potential lack of independence through the ownership of shares, representing major shareholders, etc. Yet they've adopted the attitude, which I believe is one's obligation, that no matter who they represent, their primary obligation is to do the best by the board on which they sit. In other words, they see the parties they represent as being part of their background and expertise which they bring to the board, rather than being captive to that party and having to only champion matters which that party requires. Taking that attitude allows them to be team members, focused entirely on the entity at hand. And indeed, as I have said a little earlier, they can be powerful and wonderful directors. Conflicts of interest are generally, in my opinion, able to be handled where everyone round the table knows of them. I have found that the danger in conflicts of interests is secrecy. If someone doesn't enunciate up front their conflict and it's not known to the remainder of the board, it can not only produce bad decision-making, but bring discredit to the board as a whole. On the other hand, when the conflict is known, each of the other directors are aware of it. They can operate within that, and in the extreme, actually ask the person to leave the room. I reiterate, I don't fear conflict of interest as much as I fear the ignorance of such. Considerations of independence are difficult. We live in a comparatively small country, and quite often, in my experience, in order to get someone who's truly independent, you've got to go out into the park and find somebody who's never done anything in their lives. Often, where a person has experience, particularly in specialised areas of business, that might affect their independence. But if they take an independent thinking in mind and are constantly reminding themselves of that, as I said earlier, they can be wonderful and powerful directors. The board of an enterprise should be aware, in my opinion, of who they are and what's required of them. I therefore believe strongly in charters, which clearly state not only what the board will do, but also what its committees will seek to achieve. A good board does not seek to micromanage the operations of an entity. The most important thing that a board does is hire and fire the chief executive and indeed his or her immediate reports. The corollary of appointing the best person to these jobs is that you have to allow them to operate. The worst boards I've sit on have been boards that want everything to come before them. I've seen boards slow company development down and indeed demoralise management. The result has been very serious, not just for the entity, but for everyone involved. The better approach, in my opinion, is an extension of what I said about the chairman's role. The board must choose carefully who is their chief executive and the team that relates to him or her. Once done, they must let them fly, watching carefully and also nurturing. They must ensure that succession exists for these positions, and they must not give them excuses for failure on the basis that the board told them to do so. I accept that one's got to keep a close check on management and make sure that they don't believe that absolute control rises in their hands. But I accept also that the boundary between taking from management what they're doing and keeping an eye on them is quite distinct and able to be found. Many a time I've been asked what makes a good director. My concept of a good director may not be yours, but I have a few truths that I'd like to put to you. As you'd expect, a director who, in my opinion, adopts an independence of mind is certainly superior to a person who comes with a designated cause or represents a particular stakeholder and will not alter for the benefit of the entity. Second, I believe a director who adopts a professional approach is, in my opinion, much better than one who's just there because it's a good outing and allows them some relevance, particularly in older age. It is a very important role, as Kate said earlier, and must be seen as such. It's not a reward for a long career, nor is it a job for someone whose principal thinking in life is to have time to perfect their golf swing or some other, no doubt, appropriate cause. Like everything that is serious, it requires education. I compliment the AIST on running the relevant development courses, and I note also that the Australian Institute of Company Directors does the same as well, but perhaps not with the particular slant towards trusteeship. I've given and taken these courses, and I want to tell you, as I get older, I'm amazed at how much is going on that I don't know anything about. I urge you to think about continuous education. If you think about the doctors and the other professionals that one visits, the worst is a practitioner who hasn't honed their benefits and their causes and their ideas. They are the ones who still believe penicillin's the thing to give you, when in fact it might not be the right thing. In my opinion, we as directors have to keep ourselves at the knife edge at all time. Finally, on directors, I believe team players are undoubtedly better than individualists round the board table. That doesn't mean that one wants only team players who kowtow to the views of others, but one certainly doesn't want petulance or indeed those who can't see the views of others. Dogmatism and so on should be left at the door. But on the other hand, a keenness to put one's point of view, to listen to others and to bring about a better result, in my opinion, are the hallmarks of a great director. Following from the somewhat lengthy discourse, let me deal, as I come to near the end of this speech, with a few questions that I've been asked by the organisers to deal with. I suspect they might have given me these in case I can't read tweets, etc., etc. First, as I have been asked many times, how does one know when one's governance is right? The answer to this question, in my opinion, is that governance is a continuum. One should be seeking to improve one's governance all the time, just as one should never be of the opinion in life that anything is perfect. As one proceeds, I think one needs to be guided by a number of principles. First, as I've said above, governance can be an advantage. It's not necessarily something that's just there to slow you down. Second, one should be watching what others are doing on the governance front. Often what they're doing may not be perfect for your operations, but some mutation or slight deviation of that may well suit. Third, one should be alive to discussing these matters. If directors feel good about the way they're approaching governance and what is being achieved, often the board might be achieving, for that moment alone, the right governance. The bad news, of course, is a moment later, it may need some rejigging. I've also been asked who has the carriage of the vision for governance within an organisation. In my opinion, every director has the obligation to look at governance. The chairman, as I mentioned before, is the conductor. He or she must be open to ideas on governance coming from their fellow directors, and if it's the view of the majority, they should be implemented. I should add that stakeholders also have input on this. They can give their input either by being vocal to those who've established the fund or just by coming along to meetings, etc. of the fund. I've always found it desirable for all stakeholders to be given the opportunity to indicate their views, acknowledging that on most matters the board actually has to make a decision and must do it independently. But it follows that if stakeholders don't complain about a governance matter, then later when they get upset, it's as much their fault as it is yours. Finally, I'm often asked, what are the governance challenges facing directors and fiduciaries generally as we move into an uncertain world? And by the way, I thought that was a brilliant question, except that I believe the future is always uncertain, so everyone's been moving into uncertain worlds ever since it started. This is a complex issue. It is clear to me that there is a general movement in society to put as much blame as possible on the board of directors, be it the trustees or a board of the entity involved. This is a particular challenge because as organisations grow bigger, it's a fact that the board can't be responsible for every aspect of day-to-day operations, and the recognition has to be accepted that the board can only set down policies and seek to oversee these. It is not possible, and as I've said previously, should not be the case, that the board manages the enterprise on a day-to-day basis. Similarly, the board can't be insurers for results of the business. Businesses by their nature must be recognised to involve risk, and placing liability on boards who operate correctly but take a risk which causes loss will have the adverse consequence that they will never take risks and therefore reduce the chance of success for the fund and of the operations generally. In my view, the greatest governance challenge ahead of us is an understanding by all parties where they fit, what's their liability should be, and how the organisation should be run. And a failure to appropriately apportion responsibility, as it would be in an orchestra, will be that the music played will be terrible, or even worse, very pedestrian. A correct understanding, an appropriate division of responsibilities, and with all parties understanding and operating independently, will, in my view, result in beautiful music being played, and let's hope that occurs.